After today, this family owes you nothing." My husband said it while my father's casket was still sitting 10 feet away under white lilies and soft church lights. I remember the smell of rain on everyone's coats and the sound of my mother-in-law's heels clicking across the marble floor as she stepped beside him and quietly added, "Victor protected you for too long, Elena." My fingers tightened around the folded funeral program until the paper bent in half. I had spent the last 11 months sleeping beside hospice machines, measuring morphine doses at 3 in the morning, and listening to my father struggle for breath while Brandon complained that I was too emotional to think about the future. Then, less than an hour after the funeral ended, he looked at me in front of his entire family and said, "You need to start being realistic about your life now." Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart, or if you've ever felt small in a room full of people who were supposed to love you, I'd really appreciate you taking a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And if you're listening right now, tell me your city or country and your local time in the comments. I always read them late at night when the house gets quiet. My name is Elena Castillo. I'm 32 years old, and the night after my father's funeral was the night I realized my marriage had been built on something colder than love. It started long before the funeral home, long before the rain, long before Brandon looked at me like I was already disposable. My father, Victor Castillo, had owned a regional shipping company outside Milwaukee for almost 30 years. Not massive wealth, not private jets or magazine covers, just warehouses, trucks, contracts, and a reputation strong enough that people trusted him with their businesses. He built everything slowly, the way some men build old churches, brick by brick, without ever talking about it. When I was little, he used to bring me coffee-flavored ice cream after school and let me sit in his office pretending to stamp invoices while he handled payroll. Even when the company got bigger, he still drove the same silver Ford pickup with the cracked leather seats and kept loose peppermint candies in the center console. Brandon used to say my father looked like a guy who got lucky in the 80s and never updated himself. My father would just smile politely and change the subject. Looking back now, I think he understood Brandon long before I did. The church parking lot was almost empty by the time the funeral ended. Gray clouds hung low over the city, and rainwater dripped from the edge of the awning in uneven little streams. Brandon unlocked the SUV and tossed his keys into the cup holder harder than necessary. "You didn't even thank my mother," he said while adjusting the heat. I stared out the passenger window. "For what?" "For organizing the reception, for helping you survive today." I almost laughed at that word, survive. Diane Whitmore had spent the entire afternoon telling distant relatives how exhausting grief had been for Brandon. Not me. Him. "This has been so hard on my son," she kept saying while I stood 2 feet away, wearing the same black dress I'd bought for my father's hospital prayer service 3 weeks earlier. Brandon turned onto the freeway, windshield wipers moving in slow, steady rhythms. "We should talk about the house," he said casually. My stomach tightened immediately. "What about it?" "Your father's place is too expensive now. Utilities alone are probably what, $600 a month? I haven't even buried him yet." "Elena, come on," he exhaled sharply. "This is exactly what I mean. You keep reacting emotionally instead of practically." I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. My nail polish was chipped from helping hospice nurses change sheets the night before my father died. I hadn't slept more than 4 hours in almost a week. "What's practical?" I asked quietly. "Selling the house before things get complicated." "Complicated for who?" He didn't answer right away. That silence told me more than the words eventually did. My mother thinks it would be smarter if we consolidated things financially for a while. Consolidated. Brandon loved words like that. Words that made control sound responsible. "You mean put everything under your name?" He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Don't start." I asked a question. "And I'm trying to help you." His voice sharpened enough that I turned toward him. "You don't have a job right now. You drained most of your savings helping your dad. I'm the only stable thing you have left." That sentence settled over the car heavier than the rain outside. I watched headlights blur across the wet highway, while something cold slowly opened inside my chest. Not anger yet, just awareness. The kind that arrives quietly before your whole life changes shape. When we got home, Diane and Ethan were already there waiting inside our kitchen. Ethan sat at the counter scrolling his phone while Diane unpacked leftovers from the funeral reception like she owned the house. "There she is," Diane said without looking up. "You need to eat something before you make yourself sick." Her tone sounded gentle if you didn't listen too carefully. Brandon kissed her cheek and poured himself bourbon before loosening his tie. Nobody asked if I wanted anything. Nobody asked how I was holding up after burying my father that afternoon. Ethan finally looked up from his phone and smirked. "So what happens with the company now?" "Ethan," Diane warned softly, though she didn't actually sound upset. "It's a valid question," he said. "Victor never really prepared Elena for any of that stuff." I stood near the sink, still holding my purse. "I worked there for years." Ethan shrugged. "Reception work isn't operations." Brandon chuckled quietly into his drink. That hurt more than I expected, because he knew that wasn't true. He knew I'd spent years helping my father review vendor contracts and payroll reports before Dad got sick. He knew I'd handled scheduling during staffing shortages and negotiated 2 shipping renewals myself during COVID. But Brandon also knew his family preferred the version of me that seemed small, easier that way. Diane set a casserole dish onto the counter. "Sweetheart, nobody's attacking you. We're just worried. Your father handled everything. And now," she let the sentence trail off delicately. "Now what?" I asked. Her eyes softened in that careful, practiced way wealthy women use before saying cruel things politely. "Now you have to be realistic about what kind of life you can maintain." Brandon sat beside Ethan and loosened his watch. "Mom's right." Then he looked directly at me and said the sentence I would replay in my head for months afterward. "Without your father, you're basically starting from nothing." The room went completely quiet after that. Even Ethan stopped moving. I stared at my husband, suddenly aware of how relaxed he looked, saying something that brutal, like he'd been waiting a long time to finally say it out loud. And in that moment, standing in my own kitchen with funeral flowers still sitting beside the refrigerator, I realized something terrifying. My father wasn't the only person I had lost that week. Later that night, after everyone finally left, I drove alone to my father's house because I couldn't breathe inside mine anymore. The porch light still glowed warm against the rain, exactly the way he always left it for me. Inside, the air smelled faintly like old coffee, cedar wood, and the antiseptic lotion hospice nurses used on his hands. His reading glasses were still resting beside the recliner. Half a crossword puzzle sat unfinished on the side table. I stood there listening to the grandfather clock tick through the silence until I noticed something strange. One of the drawers in my father's desk wasn't fully closed, and taped beneath it was a small brass key I had never seen before. The brass key was smaller than I expected, tarnished around the edges like it had been handled for years. I stood alone in my father's office, turning it over in my palm, while rain tapped softly against the windows. The desk lamp still cast that warm amber circle across the wood, exactly the way he liked it when he worked late. For a second, I could almost hear him clearing his throat behind me or asking if I wanted coffee before we started reviewing invoices together. My father always drank terrible coffee after 8 at night. Too strong, too bitter. He used to joke that good coffee made people weak. I sat slowly in his chair and looked around the room I had known since childhood. The walls were lined with framed shipping maps, old company photos, and one faded picture of me sitting on his shoulders at Summerfest when I was maybe 6 years old. I remember that night clearly because I spilled lemonade all over his shirt and cried for 20 minutes thinking I ruined everything. He had laughed, bought me another lemonade, and carried me through the crowd anyway. "People matter more than things, Elena," he told me while fireworks exploded over Lake Michigan. "Always remember that." Growing up, it was just the two of us most of the time. My mother left when I was 9. California. A new boyfriend. Promises to call more often that slowly disappeared into birthdays missed, and Christmas cards signed with rushed handwriting. My father never spoke badly about her. Not once. Even when I slammed cabinet doors as a teenager and demanded to know why she did not want us anymore. "Some people leave because they are lost," he told me one winter while fixing the kitchen sink himself after midnight. "It does not mean you were not worth staying for." Looking back now, I realize he spent most of my life quietly protecting me from feeling abandoned. That was who Victor Castillo was. Quiet protection, quiet sacrifice, quiet love. Which is probably why Brandon never understood him. Brandon liked things loud, loud confidence, loud ambition, loud opinions at dinner parties about markets and investments and people he thought mattered. The first time I brought Brandon home 8 years ago, my father grilled steaks outside, while Brandon stood beside him talking about private equity firms and luxury condos downtown. I remember watching through the kitchen window while my father listened politely, nodding every few minutes without saying much. Later that night, after Brandon left, Dad sat at the counter eating leftover potato salad straight from the bowl. "He is polished," he said carefully. "What does that mean?" I asked. My father shrugged. "It means polished things scratch easily." I rolled my eyes back then because I thought my father was being old-fashioned. Brandon was handsome, educated, successful, confident, in rooms that made me nervous. He wore expensive watches and always knew which wine to order. When he walked into restaurants, hostesses straightened their posture slightly. My father drove a 12-year-old truck and still clipped coupons from the Sunday paper. At 24 years old, I thought confidence meant security. I did not understand the difference yet. The office smelled faintly like cedar and old printer paper. I slid open the desk drawer fully and noticed something tucked into the back corner beneath a stack of utility receipts. A small envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Not elegant handwriting either. Blocky. Slightly uneven. The way he wrote everything, my chest tightened immediately. I stared at it for several seconds before touching it because suddenly opening it felt dangerous somehow, like crossing into something that could not be undone. Before I could stop myself, I heard Brandon's voice in my head from earlier that evening. "Without your father, you are basically starting from nothing." The cruelty of it landed differently now, sitting in this room surrounded by evidence of how deeply my father had loved me. Brandon never understood quiet people. He mistook gentleness for weakness. I slid my finger carefully beneath the envelope flap. But before I could pull the paper out, headlights flashed across the front windows of the house. A car door slammed outside. My stomach dropped instantly. Nobody should have known I was here. I stood quickly and moved toward the front hallway just as someone knocked sharply against the door. 3 hard knocks. Then Brandon's voice. "Elena, open the door." I froze. His tone sounded different than before. Not angry exactly. Nervous. I stayed silent. Another knock. Louder this time. "I know your car is here." I looked down at the envelope still clutched tightly in my hand. "We need to talk." Rainwater dripped steadily from the porch roof outside while my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then Brandon said something through the door that made every hair on my arm stand up. "My mother found out something about your father's will." Rain dripped steadily from the edge of the porch roof while I stood frozen in my father's hallway, holding that envelope against my chest like it could somehow protect me. Brandon knocked again, sharper this time. "Elena, open the door." I could picture him standing there in his charcoal coat with rain darkening the shoulders, jaw tight, one hand shoved impatiently into his pocket. For years, I had been the one smoothing things over when Brandon got irritated. I apologized first. I lowered my voice first. I told myself marriage meant compromise, even when compromise somehow always seemed to mean me becoming smaller. But something about standing inside my father's house changed the shape of that instinct. "What did Diane find out?" I asked through the door. Silence for half a second. Then, "Can we not do this out here?" His voice softened slightly, almost careful. "Please." That word sounded strange coming from him tonight. I unlocked the door but kept the chain latched. Brandon exhaled when he saw me. His hair was damp from the rain, and his expression carried something unfamiliar beneath the frustration. Anxiety. "Your father updated some paperwork before he died," he said. "Mom heard it from someone at church." "What paperwork?" "I do not know exactly." He rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Something involving the company." The envelope in my hand suddenly felt heavier. "Why are you nervous?" I asked quietly. Brandon blinked. "I am not nervous." But he was. I had spent 8 years studying the tiny shifts in his expressions, the same way people study weather patterns before storms. The tightness around his mouth, the controlled breathing, the way he avoided direct eye contact when he was calculating something. "Elena, open the door." "No." His eyes narrowed slightly at that. Not anger yet. Surprise. "You are grieving and exhausted. You should not be alone right now." The concern might have sounded convincing if it had come before the conversation about selling my father's house. "I think I need some space tonight." His jaw tightened again. "This is your husband standing outside." "I know." Rainwater rolled down the porch steps between us. Finally, Brandon nodded once like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "Fine, but call me in the morning." Then he added softly, "And do not make any decisions before we talk." That sentence lingered long after his taillights disappeared down the street. Do not make any decisions before we talk. Not before you think. Not before you ask questions. Not before you realize your life is worth more than what someone else tells you it is. My father used to say versions of that constantly when I was growing up, especially after my mother left. He taught me how to pause before trusting people too quickly. Ironically, the one time I failed to follow that advice was with Brandon. I locked the door again and returned slowly to the office. The grandfather clock near the staircase clicked softly through the silence. Midnight now. I sat back down behind my father's desk and finally pulled the letter from the envelope. "Elena, if you are reading this, it means I probably waited too long to explain certain things to you." My throat tightened immediately. My father's handwriting looked shakier than normal, probably from the chemotherapy. I kept reading. "You always believed kindness could fix people. That is one of the things I love most about you. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far over the lake. There was more beneath it. Instructions, short and specific. The brass key belonged to a safety deposit box downtown at Lakeshore Trust Bank. My father wanted me to open it privately before discussing anything with Brandon or the Whitmores. At the very bottom, underlined twice, he wrote, "Trust what people do when they think you have nothing left to offer." I barely slept that night. Around 6:30 in the morning, pale gray light crept through the kitchen windows while I sat at the table drinking stale coffee from one of Dad's old brewer's mugs. My phone buzzed twice with texts from Brandon. "Call me when you wake up." Then 10 minutes later, "Mom thinks there may be issues with the business. Do not panic before we know facts." Facts? Funny word considering nobody had bothered asking what I already knew about the company. During my father's illness, I had quietly stepped back into operations more than anyone realized. Vendor approvals, insurance renewals, shipping delays during winter storms. Small things at first. Then larger things once Dad got weaker. I remembered one afternoon 6 months earlier when I stayed at the warehouse until almost midnight, helping resolve a scheduling disaster after 2 drivers quit unexpectedly. My father sat in the office wrapped in a blanket watching me reorganize routes on the whiteboard. "You see patterns quickly," he said. "Most people only see problems." I laughed tiredly. "You are biased." "No," he said softly. "I just pay attention. Nobody else ever seemed to, especially Brandon. To him, my role at the company was temporary, sentimental, something I would eventually outgrow once life returned to normal. But my father had started treating me differently during those final months. Less like a daughter helping out and more like someone he was quietly preparing. At the time, I thought it was grief talking. Now I was not so sure. By 8:15, I was standing inside Lakeshore Trust Bank holding the brass key while an older woman in a navy blazer led me toward the private vault rooms downstairs. The air smelled faintly like polished metal and cold marble. "Box 214, she said kindly. "Take as much time as you need." My hands trembled slightly as I slid the key into the lock. Inside the box sat several folders, a flash drive, and one sealed envelope marked "Open Last." My heartbeat quickened immediately. Beneath the folders was something else, a leather-bound notebook I recognized instantly, my father's personal ledger, the one he never let anyone touch. I opened the first page slowly and froze almost immediately because written across the top in my father's careful block handwriting were 3 words that changed everything. "Brandon cannot know." My hands went cold the second I read those words. Brandon cannot know. I sat alone in the private vault room staring at my father's handwriting while the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. For a moment I actually looked over my shoulder even though nobody else was there. The leather notebook smelled faintly like dust and tobacco, the way my father's office used to smell after long shipping meetings. I opened to the next page slowly. Dates. Numbers. Notes written in careful block letters. Most of it looked like business records at first, until I noticed Brandon's name repeated over and over beside wire transfers and account summaries. My chest tightened. April 14. Brandon requested access to expansion account information again. Claimed Elena asked him to help review liquidity options. She did not. I blinked hard and kept reading. June 2. Diane contacted one of our lenders privately. Attempted to confirm ownership structure after my diagnosis worsened. July 19. Brandon asked whether Elena understood how vulnerable she would be after probate. I felt physically sick reading that sentence. Vulnerable after probate. Like I was not a person grieving her father, but some financial situation waiting to happen. My phone vibrated suddenly against the metal table and nearly made me jump. Brandon calling again. I let it ring out. Then another text appeared immediately after. "Where are you?" A second later. Harold Bennett called my mother this morning. "We need to talk before you sign anything." Before you sign anything, every message suddenly sounded different now. Less concern, more panic. I turned another page in the ledger and found a folded copy of an email my father had printed months earlier. From Brandon. Sent late at night almost 6 months ago. "Victor, I think Elena is too emotionally attached to the company to make rational decisions if something happens to you. I would be willing to step in temporarily to stabilize operations and protect her financially." My throat closed so tightly I had to set the paper down. Stabilize operations. Protect her financially. He wrote it like he was offering help. Like he was some responsible husband trying to save me from myself. But I knew Brandon well enough to hear the real meaning underneath those words. Control, ownership, access. Suddenly, memories started rearranging themselves in my head, like furniture being dragged across a dark room. Brandon insisting I let him handle investment conversations during dinner parties. Brandon asking detailed questions about company contracts after my father got sick. Brandon encouraging me to step away from meetings because stress was not good for me emotionally. At the time, I thought he was trying to support me. Now I realized he had been quietly positioning himself for something. There was another document beneath the email, a printed legal draft dated 3 months earlier. Preliminary transition proposal. My eyes scanned the page rapidly. Temporary financial oversight. Shared marital authority. Emergency executive transition recommendations. Brandon's name appeared twice. Diane's attorney appeared once. I actually stopped breathing for a second. They had already started planning before my father even died. "Miss Castillo?" The bank employee knocked gently against the half-open door. I looked up too quickly. "Are you all right?" "Yes." My voice sounded thin. "I just need another minute." She smiled politely and stepped away again. The second the door closed, I grabbed my phone and called Harold Bennett. He answered immediately. "Elena." "Did my father know?" I whispered. Silence. Then a slow exhale. "Your father knew enough to become concerned." "Concerned about what exactly?" "About how interested your husband became in company structure after the diagnosis." My stomach twisted hard. "How long?" "Several months." I pressed my hand against my forehead. "Why did nobody tell me?" Harold's voice softened slightly. "Because your father believed you loved your husband, and he did not want his suspicions to destroy your marriage, unless he was certain." I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny, because suddenly I could hear my own naivete echoing back at me. He was certain eventually, was he not? Another silence. "Elena," Harold said carefully, "there are additional documents you have not read yet." My eyes moved toward the sealed envelope marked "Open Last." "What is in there?" "Something your father instructed me not to discuss over the phone." My heartbeat quickened again. "You are frightening me." "Good," Harold said quietly, "because you should be careful right now." The line went silent for half a second before he added, "Your husband does not yet understand that Victor changed the will completely." Completely. I closed my eyes. Outside the vault room, I could hear distant footsteps and the muted sound of elevator doors opening somewhere upstairs. "What was Brandon expecting?" I asked. Harold hesitated long enough that I knew I was not going to like the answer. He believed the company would enter shared marital control after probate finalized. I opened my eyes slowly. "Meaning me. Meaning both of you jointly." My father knew. Somehow that hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. Because it meant my father spent the last months of his life quietly watching the man I married circle his business like a patient predator while trying not to break my heart. I gathered the folders quickly, my hands trembling harder now. "Elena," Harold said before I hung up, "do not go home yet." But it was already too late for that. The moment I stepped out of the bank onto the wet Milwaukee sidewalk, I saw Brandon's SUV parked across the street, and the second he spotted the folders in my hands, his entire face changed. For a second, neither of us moved. Cars hissed through the wet intersection behind him while Brandon stood across the street staring at the folders in my arms like he already knew something had slipped beyond his control. He crossed the street quickly, shoulders tense beneath his dark coat. "Why are you here?" he asked the second he reached me. Not hello, not are you okay, just that. I tightened my grip on the leather notebook inside my bag. "I could ask you the same thing." His eyes flicked toward the bank entrance behind me. "Harold called my mother. She was worried." "About me?" I asked quietly. Brandon hesitated just long enough. "About everything." Rain mist drifted between us. He lowered his voice. "Can we go somewhere private?" Normally I would have said yes automatically. 8 years of marriage trains certain reflexes into your body. Keep things calm. Keep things quiet. Protect the relationship first. But suddenly I could hear my father's words from the letter again. "Trust what people do when they think you have nothing left to offer." "I am fine talking here," I said. Brandon exhaled sharply through his nose. "Elena, stop acting like I am your enemy." That almost made me laugh. Instead I asked, "Did you ask my father about controlling the company after he died?" His expression froze for half a heartbeat before smoothing out again. Too late. I saw it. "Your father was sick," he said carefully. "We were discussing contingency plans." "Without telling me?" "Because you were overwhelmed." He stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "You could barely sleep. You were emotionally exhausted. Somebody had to think practically." Practically. That word again. Always wrapped around manipulation like ribbon around a knife. "Did Diane contact lenders behind my back too?" His jaw tightened instantly. "Who told you that?" There it was. Not denial, just calculation. "So she did." Brandon rubbed rainwater from his forehead impatiently. "You are twisting things." "Am I?" "My mother was trying to help stabilize the business if things became complicated after probate. By putting you in control? By protecting our future." His voice sharpened enough that 2 pedestrians glanced briefly toward us while passing. Brandon lowered it again immediately. "Elena, listen to yourself right now. You are grieving and people are filling your head with nonsense." People, not facts, not documents. People. I stared at the man I married and suddenly realized how many years I spent translating his behavior into kinder versions of itself. Ambition became confidence. Control became protection. Dismissiveness became stress. My father used to watch me do it constantly. "You always rewrite people into who you hope they are," he told me once after Brandon mocked one of our warehouse managers during dinner. Eventually that becomes exhausting. At the time I defended Brandon for 20 straight minutes. Now I wondered if my father already knew then. Brandon's phone buzzed suddenly in his pocket. "Diane?" Her name flashed across the screen before he silenced it quickly. "She is worried about you," he said. "No," I answered softly. "She is worried about those folders." His eyes moved to my bag again, too fast, too interested. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally he said, "Come home with me." Home. The word felt strange suddenly, like a place I no longer recognized. "I think I need some time." Time for what? His frustration finally cracked through. "To let Harold Bennett poison you against your own husband?" "My own husband already handled that himself." Brandon stared at me like he did not recognize the sentence that came out of my mouth. Honestly, neither did I. I turned and walked toward my car before my hands started shaking visibly again. "Elena." I stopped, but did not turn around. "Whatever is in those documents," he said carefully, "we should handle it together. Together." The same man who discussed gaining control of my father's company, without telling me now, wanted togetherness. I drove back to my father's house alone. My phone rang 4 times during the 20-minute drive. Brandon twice, Diane once, then Ethan. I ignored all of them. By evening, the messages started changing tone. Brandon first. "I am sorry if this morning got heated." Then 30 minutes later, "You know I love you." Then another, "Your father trusted me too." Diane sent an email just before 7. Subject line, "Family communication." I almost deleted it unread until curiosity won. "Elena, grief creates misunderstanding. Brandon has only tried to protect you during an impossible situation. Victor was not always rational during the final months of his illness, and sometimes became suspicious unnecessarily. We would hate to see temporary emotions damage your marriage permanently. Temporary emotions, like my father's concerns were medication side effects instead of instincts proven correct. Ethan texted around 8:30. "You are making this way bigger than it needs to be." Brandon left a voicemail an hour later. I listened to it while standing at the kitchen sink washing one of my father's old coffee mugs. "Elena," he said quietly, voice softer than usual. "I know you are hurt, but you are isolating yourself and letting grief distort things. Please call me back. I am worried about you." Worried. That word landed differently now, too. Because every message, every voicemail, every carefully worded email circled the same thing without saying it directly. The company, the money, the will. Not once did Brandon ask if I had eaten. Not once did Diane ask how I slept after burying my father. Not once did anyone ask if I was surviving the loneliness sitting inside this silent house. Around midnight, I finally opened the sealed envelope marked "Open Last." Inside was a single handwritten letter from my father and one attached document paper-clipped behind it. I read the first line once, then twice. By the third time, I could barely breathe. Because my father had not only changed the will before he died, he had changed something else too. Something Brandon clearly did not know existed. I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the papers while the clock ticked softly through the dark house, and for the first time in my entire marriage, I realized there was nobody left I could trust enough to call. The letter trembled slightly in my hands while the kitchen clock clicked through the silence. My father's handwriting looked weaker near the bottom of the page, thinner somehow, like even holding the pen had exhausted him during those final weeks. "Elena, if you are reading this, it means I ran out of time to explain everything face to face." I closed my eyes for a second after reading that line because suddenly I could picture him exactly as he looked 3 days before he died. Thin gray sweater, oxygen tube resting beneath his nose. The late afternoon sun cutting across the hospital blanket while he watched snow fall outside the window without saying much. I remembered fixing his pillow while he quietly studied my face. "You look tired," he said softly. "You need rest." I laughed a little back then. "You are literally dying and you are still worried about me sleeping." He smiled faintly. "That is what parents do." At the time, I thought he was simply saying goodbye in his own careful way. Now I realized he had probably already made peace with something I still refused to see. The attached document beneath the letter was not another will. It was a transfer agreement. 6 months earlier, my father had legally moved controlling ownership of Castillo Freight Holdings into a protected trust under my sole authority. Not marital authority, not joint oversight, mine. Harold Bennett's signature sat beside my father's at the bottom of every page. Brandon's name appeared nowhere. I sat at the kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning rereading everything while cold coffee sat untouched beside me. Outside, rainwater slid slowly down the windows. The house creaked softly around me the way old homes do when temperatures drop overnight. And for the first time since my father died, the grief stopped feeling sharp and started feeling heavy instead. Like carrying wet concrete inside my chest, I kept thinking about the last Thanksgiving we spent together before the cancer spread. My father insisted on cooking even though he got tired after 20 minutes on his feet. Brandon spent half the afternoon talking about real estate investments with Ethan, while my father quietly basted turkey in the kitchen wearing that old Navy apron with faded Brewers lettering across the front. At one point, Dad asked Brandon if he could help carry folding chairs in from the garage. Brandon smiled politely and said, "Give me a minute." He never got up. I remember watching my father drag the chairs himself across the driveway, while cold wind pushed dead leaves against the porch steps. Later that night, Dad sat beside me after everyone left. "You notice everything," he said quietly. "I wish you would trust what you notice." Back then, I pretended not to understand what he meant because understanding would have required admitting something painful. Around 7 in the morning, my phone buzzed again beside the sink. "Brandon." I let it ring. Then another call immediately after. Then Diane. By the 5th call, I finally answered only because exhaustion had hollowed me out enough that fighting felt impossible. "Thank God." Brandon breathed the second I picked up. "Where are you?" "Dad's house." Silence. Then, "You stayed there all night?" "Yes." "Elena, this is getting unhealthy." I almost smiled at that. Unhealthy. Like grief should fit into acceptable timelines for everyone else's convenience. I need some space. Space from what? His voice sharpened slightly. "From me trying to help you? Is that what you call it?" Another silence. Longer this time. Harold Bennett is manipulating you, Brandon said carefully. My mother talked to him yesterday and he refused to explain anything. That is not normal. Maybe because none of it involves you. The quiet on the other end of the line changed instantly. Not sadness, not confusion, calculation again. What did your father leave you? There it was. Finally honest. Not how are you, not did you sleep, just that. I leaned against the kitchen counter staring at my father's coffee mug still sitting near the dishwasher. You should have asked me that years ago, I said softly. Asked you what? Who I actually was. Before he could answer, I hung up. Then I turned my phone completely off for the first time in years. The silence afterward felt terrifying at first. No buzzing, no notifications, no careful messages trying to pull me back into explanations. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and rain tapping lightly against the roof. I spent the rest of the morning wandering through the house slowly, touching familiar things like they belonged to someone I had already started forgetting. My father's reading glasses, his jacket hanging near the back door, the half-finished crossword puzzle beside the recliner where he used to fall asleep during baseball games. Grief works strangely when the practical parts finally end. During the illness, there are medications to organize, appointments, insurance calls, nurses asking questions every hour. You become useful, busy. But after the funeral, after everyone leaves with their casseroles and sympathy cards, what remains is silence. And silence is where the real loneliness starts. Around noon, I opened the freezer and found 3 containers of homemade arroz con pollo. My father insisted on freezing before his final hospital stay because he worried I would forget to eat properly afterward. I stood there staring at the handwritten labels until tears finally came quietly and without warning. Not dramatic tears, just exhaustion leaking out slowly after months of holding myself together for everyone else. I tried, Dad. I whispered into the empty kitchen. I really tried. Nobody answered, of course. The clock kept ticking. Somewhere outside, a snowplow scraped wet slush off the street, even though it was only October. Life continuing without permission always felt cruel to me. By evening, the loneliness became physical, the kind that settles into your bones and makes every room feel too large. I sat on the living room floor wrapped in one of my father's old flannel blankets while darkness filled the windows. Part of me wanted to call Brandon despite everything, not because I trusted him anymore, because habits survive heartbreak longer than love does. Then I remembered something else my father wrote near the bottom of the letter. The hardest loneliness in life comes from finally seeing people clearly. I read that sentence 3 times under the soft yellow lamplight while the house settled quietly around me. And somewhere beneath the grief and humiliation and exhaustion, something small inside me finally started changing shape. 3 days later, I walked into Castillo Freight Holdings before sunrise, carrying my father's old leather briefcase and a paper cup of burnt coffee from the gas station down the street. The parking lot lights still glowed pale yellow against the wet pavement, and for a second I just stood there listening to diesel engines idle behind the loading docks. My father used to say you could tell how healthy the company was by the sound of the trucks before 6 in the morning. Busy engines mean people are feeding their families, he told me once when I was 16 and half asleep beside him during a snowstorm route delay. The lobby smelled exactly the same as it always had. Industrial cleaner, printer toner, stale coffee from the break room down the hall. Familiar enough that my chest tightened unexpectedly. A few employees looked up in surprise when I walked in. Most of them knew my father had died. Some had attended the funeral. Others lowered their voices awkwardly the second they saw me. "Morning, Miss Castillo," the security guard said gently. "Sorry about your dad." "Thank you, Frank." My voice still sounded fragile to my own ears. Upstairs, the executive offices felt strangely untouched. My father's assistant, Marlene, stood beside her desk, sorting invoices with red-rimmed eyes. She had worked with him almost 22 years and still wore reading glasses on a silver chain around her neck, exactly like she did the day I met her as a child. The second she saw me, her face softened. "You came back." I nodded once. "Somebody has to keep things moving." She walked around the desk and hugged me quietly before saying, "Your father hoped you would." That sentence stayed with me the rest of the morning. I spent hours reviewing shipping contracts, route schedules, fuel reports, and pending vendor renewals while weak October sunlight slowly filled the office windows. At first, my hands shook every time I signed something because part of me still felt like a child pretending to sit in an adult chair. But gradually, muscle memory returned. I knew these systems. I knew the numbers. I knew which warehouse manager ignored overtime limits and which drivers preferred overnight freight runs through Illinois because traffic stayed lighter after midnight. My father had not just raised me here. He trained me quietly for years while everyone else from their sleeves for their sleeve fivernals assumed I was simply helping out. Around 11, Marlene appeared in the doorway holding a stack of folders against her chest. "You should probably know Brandon called twice already." I kept typing without looking up. "Did you answer?" "No." She hesitated. He sounded irritated. I almost smiled at that. "That sounds familiar." Marlene studied me carefully over the top of her glasses. "Victor worried about him." I finally looked up. "How long?" "Longer than you probably want to hear." The honesty in her voice hurt more than gossip would have. She stepped farther into the office and lowered her voice slightly. "About 8 months ago, your father started restricting financial access internally. Quietly. Especially around acquisition discussions." "Because of Brandon?" Marlene nodded once. "Your father noticed he asked questions nobody outside ownership should have been asking." I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring at the framed warehouse photo behind the desk. "Why did nobody tell me?" "Because your father loved you." She said it so simply. "And because he kept hoping he was wrong." That almost broke me all over again. Not dramatically, just quietly. The kind of pain that settles behind your ribs and stays there. My phone buzzed against the desk again. "Brandon. 6th call today." I silenced it without answering. Then another notification appeared almost immediately. An email this time. Subject line, "Please stop shutting me out." I opened it before I could stop myself. "Elena, I know things feel complicated right now, but we are still married. We should not be communicating through lawyers and silence. Whatever your father put into your head before he died, please remember that I love you. I am trying to fix this before things become irreversible. Fix this." Like the problem was my reaction instead of his behavior. I closed the email without replying. At 1:30 that afternoon, I walked through the main warehouse for the first time since the funeral. Forklifts beeped softly between loading lanes, while cold autumn air drifted in through the raised dock doors. A few employees offered quiet condolences as I passed. Others simply nodded respectfully. Near Dock 7, an older driver named Luis removed his baseball cap when he saw me. "Your dad helped me keep my house after my surgery," he said quietly. "Never forgot that." I swallowed hard. "Thank you. You look like him when you are thinking," he added with a small smile before walking away. Nobody had ever said that to me before. Later that evening, I stayed long after most employees left, reviewing route delays beside the office windows while darkness settled over the freight yard outside. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt focused instead of shattered. Not healed, just occupied by something other than grief. Around 7:30, Marlene stepped into the office again, holding her coat. "You should go home." I looked down at the spreadsheet glowing on my monitor. "I think I forgot where home is." Her expression softened sadly. "Then build a new one." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet office, listening to distant truck engines rumble across the loading yard. My father's leather chair creaked softly when I leaned back. On the corner of the desk sat the old silver-framed picture of us from Summerfest all those years ago. I stared at it for a long moment before noticing something tucked partially beneath the frame. A yellow sticky note in my father's handwriting. 3 words, "You are ready." The first thing I changed was the office door. For almost 30 years, the frosted glass outside the executive suite had read Victor Castillo, President, in faded silver lettering. I stood in the hallway at 7:15 on a cold Monday morning, holding a new nameplate, while warehouse employees moved quietly through the building carrying coffee cups and route sheets. The maintenance guy, Pete, looked at me carefully before handing over the drill. "You sure you want to do it yourself?" he asked. I nodded once. "Yeah." The old screws came loose slowly. My father's name rested heavy in my hands after I lifted the plate free from the door. For a second, I just stared at it while fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Then I replaced it with the new one. Elena Castillo, President and Managing Director. Simple, clean, no dramatic moment, no applause. Just metal against glass and the quiet understanding that my life no longer belonged to the version other people expected me to remain. Pete stepped back beside me. "Looks right," he said softly. I swallowed once before answering. I hope so. By 8:05, I was already inside a budget meeting with 3 regional managers and 2 transportation supervisors twice my age. 6 weeks earlier, most of them still saw me as Victor's grieving daughter helping temporarily during a crisis. That changed quickly once they realized I actually understood the business better than expected. Fuel costs jumped another 11% in Illinois routes, Martin said while sliding reports across the conference table. If winter hits early, overnight margins are going to get ugly. I flipped through the numbers carefully. Shift 3 overnight loads through Madison instead of Milwaukee after 10 p.m. Martin blinked. That adds mileage, but cuts idle time and traffic bottlenecks. I circled one of the reports with my pen. You are losing more money sitting still than driving farther. Silence settled briefly around the table while they recalculated mentally. Finally, Martin nodded slowly. That might actually work. Across the room, Marlene tried unsuccessfully to hide a small smile. Little moments like that started happening more often. Drivers asking directly for my approval instead of waiting for senior managers. Dispatch supervisors calling me first during weather delays. Vendors suddenly using a different tone on conference calls after realizing I knew contract details without checking notes. Confidence did not arrive all at once. It built quietly through repetition. Through early mornings and 12-hour workdays and decisions that worked. My father used to say trust inside a company grows slower than concrete drying in winter. I understood what he meant now. Around noon, I walked through the operations floor carrying route binders, while several employees gathered near the break room television, watching a weather alert scroll across the screen. Snowstorm moving east faster than expected. Looks nasty, Luis muttered beside the coffee machine. Indiana routes are going to get hammered by midnight. I studied the radar map for 2 seconds. Pull the Fort Wayne loads forward 3 hours. Luis frowned slightly. Drivers are not scheduled yet. Then I will call them myself. He stared at me for a moment before nodding once. Your dad used to do that during storms. I smiled faintly. I know. By late afternoon, the building had shifted into controlled chaos. Phones ringing. Dispatch radios crackling. Forklift beeping echoes drifting up from the loading bays. I moved through the noise steadily, adjusting schedules, approving overtime, rerouting shipments before highways froze over. Nobody questioned my authority anymore by the end of that day, not because I demanded it, because competence speaks in ways titles cannot. Around 6:30, Marlene stepped into my office holding a stack of overnight manifests against her chest. There is someone downstairs asking for you. My stomach tightened instantly. Who? Her expression changed slightly. Brandon, of course. I looked past her through the office windows toward the dark freight yard, outside where snow had started falling, in soft diagonal streaks beneath the parking lot lights. Did you tell him I was busy? I told him you were in meetings. And? He said he would wait. I closed the shipping report slowly and stood. The hallway downstairs smelled faintly like wet pavement and diesel fuel when I reached the lobby. Brandon stood near reception, wearing a charcoal wool coat dusted lightly with snow. For a second, seeing him there stirred an old reflex in my chest. Familiarity. Habit. 8 years is long enough for somebody's presence to feel built into your nervous system, even after trust collapses. Then he looked up and his eyes landed on the security badge clipped beside my blazer pocket. Elena Castillo President. I watched the exact second he noticed the title. His expression shifted almost invisibly before smoothing itself back into careful concern. You have been ignoring me, he said quietly. I have been working. At this hour? I glanced through the lobby windows toward the freight yard, where crews were already preparing overnight snow routes. This company runs 24 hours a day. Brandon looked around the building slowly, like he was seeing it differently now. Maybe he was. You look different, he said finally. No, I answered calmly. You were just paying attention for the first time. The silence after that stretched long enough that even the receptionist stopped pretending not to listen. Brandon lowered his voice. Can we talk privately? About what? About us. I studied him carefully. The expensive coat, the polished shoes wet from snow, the controlled expression trying very hard not to reveal panic underneath. Then I thought about my father dragging folding chairs through cold wind alone while Brandon talked investments at Thanksgiving dinner. I do not think there is an us right now, I said softly. Something flickered across his face then. Not sadness exactly, fear. Because for the first time since my father died, Brandon finally understood something important. I was no longer standing beside him. I was standing across from him. And upstairs in my office, inside the locked drawer beneath my father's old ledger, sat documents he still did not know existed. The official reading of the revised estate documents was scheduled for Thursday morning at Harold Bennett's downtown office, overlooking Lake Michigan. Snow had fallen heavily overnight, coating the sidewalks and parking meters in uneven white layers that reflected pale winter sunlight back into the city. I arrived 20 minutes early, wearing a charcoal wool coat and the silver watch my father gave me on my 25th birthday. Nothing expensive, just simple, clean, intentional. The receptionist downstairs recognized my name immediately and offered me coffee with the kind of careful politeness people use around grief. "Mr. Bennett is preparing the conference room now," she said softly. I thanked her and sat near the windows watching snowplows crawl slowly through traffic below. My hands rested calmly in my lap, but inside my chest everything felt stretched tight, not panic anymore. Something colder. Awareness. Harold's office occupied the top floor of an old limestone building that still smelled faintly like paper files and polished wood, despite every modern renovation attempt. My father trusted Harold for almost 30 years. He once told me good lawyers were not the loudest people in a room. They were the people who understood silence best. Around 9:15, the elevator doors opened across the lobby, and Brandon stepped out beside Diane and Ethan. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Diane wore cream-colored gloves and a dark camel coat that probably cost more than my first car. Ethan looked irritated already, jaw tight, phone in hand. Brandon noticed me first. For a brief second, none of them spoke. Diane recovered fastest. "Elena," she said carefully, walking toward me. "You look tired." I almost smiled at the familiarity of it. Concern used like strategy. "I am fine." Her eyes moved briefly toward the leather folder resting beside me. "We really wish you had talked to us before involving attorneys this heavily." "Dad involved the attorneys," Ethan exhaled impatiently. "Nobody is trying to take anything from you." I looked directly at him. "That is interesting, considering how often everyone discussed my financial future before knowing the will." Ethan shifted slightly. Brandon stepped in smoothly before he answered. "Can we not do this here?" There was that tone again. Controlled. Diplomatic. The version of Brandon other people trusted immediately because he sounded reasonable even when he was manipulating a conversation. For years, I mistook calmness for honesty. Harold appeared moments later from the hallway, carrying several legal folders against his chest. His silver-framed glasses caught the overhead light as he glanced between all of us. "Good, everyone is here." Nobody moved immediately. The tension hanging in the lobby felt almost physical now. Finally, Harold gestured toward the conference room. "Please." The room itself overlooked the frozen lake through massive windows fogged lightly at the corners from the cold outside. A long walnut table sat beneath recessed lighting with neatly arranged legal packets placed at every chair. Harold took his seat near the head of the table while the rest of us settled slowly around him. I noticed Brandon watching every folder carefully the second he sat down. His attention barely touched me anymore. It stayed fixed on the documents, on ownership, on risk. Diane folded her gloves neatly beside her water glass. "Before we begin," she said calmly, "I would like to remind everyone that emotions have been unusually high these past few weeks." Harold did not even look up from his paperwork. "This is not a therapy session, Diane." Ethan coughed once to hide what looked suspiciously like amusement. Brandon leaned forward slightly. "We are simply hoping for transparency." Harold finally looked directly at him then. Transparency would have been useful several months ago. Silence settled heavily across the table after that. Brandon's expression barely changed, but I saw his fingers tighten once against the edge of his chair. Outside the windows, snow drifted steadily across the gray skyline while traffic crawled slowly below. Harold opened the first folder carefully. "As you are aware, Victor Castillo amended several estate and ownership structures prior to his death." Diane spoke immediately. "Under questionable emotional circumstances." Harold removed his glasses slowly. "Are you suggesting your late friend lacked legal competence?" Diane hesitated just long enough. "I am suggesting cancer medications can affect judgment." Something sharp moved quietly through me hearing that. Not rage exactly, just clarity. Even now, they were still trying to reduce my father into weakness so they could protect their version of events. Harold's voice stayed perfectly even. Victor Castillo completed every revision under independent legal evaluation with full cognitive certification from his physicians. Ethan looked toward Brandon quickly at that. Small movement, easy to miss. But I noticed. Brandon spoke carefully. Nobody is questioning Victor's intentions. Harold held his gaze for a long second. I believe that is exactly what is happening. The room fell silent again. Somewhere outside the conference room, a copier hummed faintly down the hallway. I could hear Diane's bracelet shift softly whenever she moved her wrist. Tiny sounds suddenly felt unbearably loud. Harold opened another folder and slid several documents across the table toward me first. Elena, these are the finalized trust certifications and executive transfer records. Brandon's eyes dropped instantly toward the papers. Harold continued calmly. As of 6 months prior to Victor's death, Castillo Freight Holdings officially transferred into sole protected trust ownership under Elena Castillo. Ethan blinked hard. Diane's face lost color almost imperceptibly. Brandon stayed very still, too still. That is not possible, Diane said quietly. Harold folded his hands together. It is already legally executed, Brandon finally spoke, voice low and controlled. Victor discussed temporary transition structures with me personally. Harold looked at him without expression. I am aware. Something dangerous flickered behind Brandon's eyes, then disappeared again almost immediately. Then there has clearly been some misunderstanding. No, Harold answered softly. There has not. The air inside the room seemed thinner suddenly, colder. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickening, because for the first time since my father died, I understood something completely. Brandon still believed he could talk his way through this. He still believed charm and composure could rearrange reality if he stayed calm enough. Harold reached for the final folder beside his elbow, then paused briefly before opening it. Unfortunately, he said quietly, there is another matter Victor instructed me to disclose today regarding attempted financial interference before his death. And that was the exact moment Brandon finally stopped looking confident. The room stayed completely silent after Harold spoke. Even the heating vents seemed quieter somehow. Snow drifted slowly past the conference room windows, while Brandon sat motionless beside Diane, one hand resting flat against the polished walnut table, like he was physically holding himself together. Harold opened the final folder carefully and removed several printed documents clipped together with colored tabs marking certain sections. He did not rush. That was the part that unnerved everyone most. Calmness, precision. My father always said the truth never needed dramatic delivery. Over the last 7 months, Harold began evenly. Victor Castillo documented multiple attempts to gain unauthorized influence over company assets and estate planning discussions. Diane straightened immediately. That sounds extremely exaggerated. Harold slid one of the pages across the table toward her without responding emotionally. These are copies of communication records between yourself and Northern State Lending regarding Castillo Freight Holdings. Diane glanced down at the page, and for the first time since I met her 8 years ago, I watched her composure crack slightly around the eyes. Those were exploratory conversations, she said quickly. Families discuss contingencies all the time. Without ownership authorization? Harold asked calmly. She looked toward Brandon immediately. Reflex. Instinct. Protection, Brandon finally spoke. Nobody was attempting anything unethical. Harold removed another document from the folder. Then perhaps you can explain this. He slid a printed email across the table directly toward Brandon this time. I recognized it instantly from the bank documents. The same late-night message my father printed months earlier. Brandon read the first line, and his jaw tightened visibly. Ethan leaned sideways, trying to read part of it from where he sat. What is that? He asked quietly. Nobody answered him. Harold folded his hands together. This correspondence proposed transferring operational authority into Brandon Whitmore's oversight under the assumption Elena Castillo would be emotionally incapable of executive decision-making after her father's death. The sentence landed heavily in the room. Brandon looked up immediately. That was taken out of context. What context improves it? I asked softly before I could stop myself. His eyes moved toward me then. For a second, something almost human appeared there. Embarrassment, maybe, or realization. Elena, he said carefully, your father was dying. I was trying to prepare for worst-case scenarios. By discussing control structures without me, You were overwhelmed. I was his daughter. The quietness in my own voice surprised even me. Brandon leaned forward slightly. And I was your husband. No, I answered calmly. You were planning around me like I was a problem to manage. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside him, while Diane stared hard at the documents in front of her without speaking. Harold reached for another page. Victor Castillo also documented concerns regarding repeated inquiries into trust access, insurance leverage, and marital financial consolidation after his diagnosis became terminal. Brandon exhaled sharply through his nose. This is insane. Harold looked directly at him. No, it is documented. Then he slid a handwritten ledger page across the table toward Brandon. My father's handwriting covered almost every inch of the page. Dates, notes, observations. One section circled twice in dark ink. Brandon referred to Elena as vulnerable during probate discussion. Repeated emphasis on simplifying ownership transition before estate finalization. Victor became paranoid near the end, Diane said suddenly. Too quickly, too defensive. Pain medication changes people. Harold's expression did not move. Victor completed psychological competency reviews before every legal revision. Silence again, the kind that stretches so tightly it almost hums. I looked toward the lake outside the windows for a second because suddenly I could not bear staring directly at any of them. Ice floated in broken sheets near the shoreline while gray winter light filled the room coldly. My father knew. That thought still hurt in ways I could not fully explain. Not because he changed the will, because he spent his final months watching me love people who were already positioning themselves around my grief. Brandon finally spoke again, quieter now. You really believe I married you for money? I looked back at him slowly. I think you liked the version of me that needed you. His face changed after that. Not anger, something heavier, because deep down he probably knew it was true. Harold closed the folder in front of him gently. There is one final matter Victor instructed me to address today. Nobody moved. Harold turned toward me first. Elena, your father wanted this disclosed publicly, only if necessary. My heartbeat slowed strangely. Necessary for what? Harold hesitated briefly. For your protection. Then he looked directly at Brandon. 3 months before his death, Victor Castillo legally removed Brandon Whitmore from all future executive consideration and amended marital access protections due to evidence of undisclosed personal debt. Ethan turned sharply toward his brother. What? Diane's head snapped toward Brandon almost violently. Debt? Brandon's composure finally fractured completely. That is private. Harold opened another document calmly. Approximately $480,000 across personal investment losses and leveraged property exposure. The room went still, truly still this time. Ethan stared openly now. Diane looked physically pale beneath the conference room lights. I felt like the floor beneath me shifted slightly, even though I already knew pieces of this from the ledger. Hearing the actual number spoken aloud made everything uglier somehow, more real. Brandon looked directly at me. I was going to fix it. Using my father's company? I asked quietly. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. That silence answered more than any confession could have. Harold's voice remained perfectly even. Victor believed financial pressure significantly influenced Brandon's interest in estate consolidation, Diane whispered, almost to herself. You never told me it was that bad. Brandon looked away from everyone then. Just for a second. But it was enough. Enough for Ethan to finally lean back in his chair like he no longer recognized his own brother. Enough for me to realize the marriage I spent 8 years protecting had probably started breaking long before my father ever got sick. Then Harold slid one final envelope across the table toward me. Thick cream paper. My name written across the front in my father's handwriting. Elena. Open in front of them. My hands stayed steady as I picked up the envelope, but inside my chest something old and painful shifted quietly. The conference room had gone completely silent, except for the soft hum of the heating vents and distant traffic muffled beneath the snow outside. Brandon stared at the envelope like he already knew it contained something irreversible. Diane sat perfectly still beside him, both hands folded tightly together now. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable for the first time since this entire nightmare began. I slid my finger carefully beneath the flap and unfolded the letter inside. The paper smelled faintly like my father's office. Ink, cedarwood, coffee. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Elena, if you are reading this in front of them, Then it means my instincts were correct. My throat tightened, but I kept reading silently for another few seconds before Harold spoke softly. Victor asked that the letter be read aloud. Brandon looked away immediately. I took a slow breath and began reading. My daughter spent most of her life believing love meant patience, understanding, and sacrifice. Those qualities make her kind, but they also make her vulnerable to people who mistake kindness for weakness. The room stayed perfectly still. If Brandon Whitmore truly loved Elena, this letter would never become necessary. Unfortunately, I no longer believe that is true. Brandon shifted in his chair sharply. This is ridiculous. Harold did not even look at him. Please continue. I lowered my eyes back to the paper. Over the last year, I watched conversations around my illness become increasingly focused on control rather than family. I listened carefully. I paid attention. And I realized my daughter was surrounded by people preparing for her grief before she had even buried me. Diane inhaled sharply beside him. Victor misunderstood intentions, she said quickly. No, I answered calmly without looking up. He understood perfectly. My own voice surprised me then. Quiet, steady, no shaking anymore. I kept reading. Elena, if you ever doubt yourself after this, remember something important. People reveal who they are most clearly when they think you are about to lose power. I paused there because suddenly I could not hear anything except my father's voice saying those words in my memory. The way he used to lean quietly against kitchen counters late at night after work, while explaining things without ever raising his voice. Brandon rubbed his forehead slowly. I never wanted to hurt you. I looked at him for the first time since opening the letter. You just planned around me. His expression tightened immediately. That is not fair. Neither was discussing my future like I was too weak to understand my own life. Diane stepped in quickly. Elena, emotions are distorting this entire situation. I folded the letter carefully before answering. No, clarity is. That shut the room quiet again. Ethan stared down at the table now instead of defending anyone. Harold finally closed the final folder in front of him and removed his glasses slowly. Legally speaking, all ownership protections are finalized and non-transferable. Brandon looked toward him sharply. Meaning, what exactly? Harold's voice remained perfectly neutral. Meaning Elena Castillo retains sole executive authority over all trust holdings, company assets, and estate-controlled property. Brandon laughed once under his breath. Not amusement, disbelief. You are seriously telling me none of this involved me? Harold met his eyes calmly. Victor specifically ensured it would not. That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could have. Brandon leaned back slowly in his chair, staring toward the windows while snow drifted across the skyline outside. For the first time since I met him, he looked smaller somehow. Not weak, just exposed. Like somebody had finally removed the version of himself he carefully performed for other people. Diane turned toward me again, softer now. Elena, we are still family. I almost smiled hearing that. Family. The same people who discussed downsizing my life before my father's funeral flowers even wilted. No, I said quietly. You were comfortable when you believed I needed you. Her expression hardened slightly. That is unfair. Is it? I asked. Because nobody asked how I was surviving after Dad died. You asked about the house, the company, probate, debt exposure. Every conversation became about management. Brandon looked down at the table. He still could not quite meet my eyes fully now. I was scared, he admitted finally. The honesty startled all of us a little. About what? I asked softly. He swallowed once before answering. Everything falling apart. So you tried controlling it first. He did not deny that. The silence afterward felt heavy but strangely clean, like finally opening windows inside a room that stayed closed too long. I gathered the documents slowly into my folder while Harold organized the remaining paperwork at the opposite end of the table. Nobody tried stopping me this time. Nobody interrupted. When I stood, Brandon finally looked up again. What happens now? That question lingered between us for several seconds. I thought about the old version of myself who would have rushed to comfort him despite everything. The woman who translated cruelty into stress and manipulation into concern because admitting the truth felt too painful. That woman still existed somewhere inside me, but she no longer controlled the room. Now, I answered carefully, I stopped confusing loyalty with self-abandonment. Diane looked stunned by that sentence. Ethan stared toward the floor. Brandon's face changed in a way I still cannot fully describe. Regret maybe, or realization arriving too late to matter. I picked up my coat slowly while snow continued falling outside the conference room windows. Before leaving, I turned toward Harold. "Thank you," he nodded once. "Your father would be proud of how calmly you handled today." Calmly. Funny word considering my entire life had cracked open over the last month. But maybe calmness was not the absence of pain. Maybe it was finally refusing to let pain make your decisions for you. As I walked toward the conference room door, Brandon stood suddenly behind me. "Elena," I stopped but did not turn around immediately. His voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it. "I did love you." I closed my eyes briefly before answering. "I think you loved being needed." Then I walked out of the room while nobody followed me. But even standing alone inside the elevator a few seconds later, staring at my reflection in the brushed steel walls, I realized something painful still remained unresolved. Because despite everything that had happened, a small part of me still mourned the man I thought my husband used to be. Spring arrived quietly that year, not all at once, just small signs at first. Melted snow sliding down Milwaukee sidewalks, delivery trucks returning without salt stains along the wheel wells. The first morning I walked into Castillo Freight Holdings, without bracing myself emotionally before opening the front door. 6 months had passed since the meeting in Harold Bennett's office, and life no longer felt like something happening to me. It finally felt like something I was living again. The company stabilized faster than most people expected. We expanded 2 regional contracts by March, opened a new distribution partnership near Green Bay in April, and for the first time in years, employee turnover dropped instead of climbing. Luis started bringing fresh pan dulce for the dispatch crew every Friday morning. Marlene stopped hovering outside my office like I might collapse if left alone too long. Even the warehouse sounded different now. Lighter somehow. More certain. I learned that leadership does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it looks like showing up consistently when nobody is clapping for you. Sometimes it looks like answering difficult calls calmly at 6 in the morning while snow falls outside loading docks. Sometimes it looks like refusing to become cruel after people hurt you. Brandon moved out completely 3 weeks after the estate meeting. The divorce process stayed quieter than most people expected. No screaming matches, no dramatic scenes. Just paperwork, lawyers, long silences, and the strange grief that comes from realizing someone you loved existed partly inside your imagination. The hardest part was not losing him. The hardest part was accepting how long I ignored myself, trying to keep the relationship alive. A few times he called late at night after the separation became official. Once around midnight in February, another time after his birthday in April. His voice always sounded softer then, less polished, more tired. "I still think about us," he admitted during the last call. I stood barefoot in my father's kitchen listening to rain tap softly against the windows while the old coffee maker hummed beside me. "I know," I answered gently. "I do too." Silence stretched between us for a few seconds. Then Brandon asked quietly, "Do you ever miss me?" I looked down at the silver watch my father gave me years ago resting against my wrist. "I miss who I thought you were." Neither of us spoke after that. Eventually, he whispered goodbye and hung up. That was the last conversation we ever had. Diane never apologized directly. People like her usually do not. Instead, she sent a handwritten Christmas card 3 months later, filled with careful sentences about family, misunderstanding, and healing. I read it once while sitting in my office during a lunch break, then folded it quietly back into the envelope without anger. Not every wound requires confrontation to heal. Some things simply lose power once you stop carrying them emotionally. Ethan surprised me most. He showed up unexpectedly one afternoon near the loading docks, holding 2 coffees and looking uncomfortable enough to be honest for the first time in his life. "I should have said something earlier," he admitted while handing me a cup. "About Brandon. About all of it." We stood beside the freight yard in cold wind, watching workers secure cargo straps beneath a gray November sky. "Why did you not?" I asked softly. Ethan stared down at his coffee. "Because it is easier to stay loyal to familiar people than truthful situations." That sentence stayed with me long after he left. Maybe because it explained more than just him. Maybe because I spent years doing the same thing myself. Some nights I still drive to my father's old house after work, even though technically it belongs to me now. The porch light still glows warm against the dark, exactly the way he always left it. His reading glasses remain beside the recliner because I still cannot bring myself to move them. The radio in the kitchen still plays soft jazz while I cook dinner alone sometimes. And honestly, the loneliness still visits occasionally. Healing is not a straight line the way inspirational quotes pretend it is. Some mornings you feel strong. Other mornings grief sneaks up quietly while standing in grocery store aisles or hearing somebody laugh the same way your father used to. But there is a difference now. The loneliness no longer feels empty. It feels honest. Looking back, I think the most dangerous thing that happened to me was not betrayal. It was slowly learning to doubt my own instincts in order to keep other people comfortable. That kind of self-abandonment happens quietly. One excuse at a time, one compromise at a time. One moment of silence after another person says something that hurts you and you convince yourself they did not mean it that way. If there is one lesson this experience taught me, it is that your intuition often whispers long before your life falls apart. Mine did. Repeatedly. I just kept choosing love over clarity because I thought loyalty meant enduring things silently. It does not. Real love should not require you to shrink in order to survive it. And if somebody only values you when they believe you are weak, dependent, grieving, or easy to control, that is not love either. That is convenience wearing the costume of affection. I also learned practical things my father tried to teach me years ago, but I only fully understood after losing him. Protect your finances, learn your own paperwork, understand your accounts, your assets, your legal rights. Never surrender complete control of your life simply because somebody says they love you. Trust should exist alongside awareness, not instead of it. And most importantly, never let another person define your worth based on what they can gain from you. Some of you listening right now probably understand exactly what I mean. Maybe somebody in your life has made you feel too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult, too weak. Maybe you have spent years translating disrespect into patience because being honest about the truth felt terrifying. If that is you, I need you to hear this clearly. You are not hard to love simply because you finally started protecting yourself. Boundaries are not cruelty. Awareness is not bitterness. And walking away from people who repeatedly diminish you is not failure. Sometimes it is the first honest act of self-respect you have ever practiced. I still believe God speaks quietly through instinct sometimes, through discomfort, through those moments when your chest tightens even while someone else insists everything is fine. My father used to say, peace never has to manipulate you into staying. I understand that now. Real peace feels steady, clear, calm enough that you no longer need to betray yourself to maintain it. A few weeks ago, I found one final note tucked inside my father's old desk while reorganizing company records. Just one sentence written on a yellow sticky note in his uneven handwriting. The right people will never require you to become smaller to keep them comfortable. I stood there holding that little piece of paper while late afternoon sunlight filled the office windows, and for the first time in a very long while, I cried without feeling broken afterward. My name is Elena Castillo. I am 32 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never ignore the quiet voice inside yourself just because somebody louder tells you not to trust it. Thank you for staying with me through this story, truly. If any part of it felt familiar to your own life, I hope you leave here tonight feeling a little less alone and a little more certain that healing is possible even after betrayal changes everything you thought you understood. And if this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you are listening from, because sometimes strangers understand each other in ways family never did. You can also subscribe if you want to hear more stories about survival, self-respect, healing, and rebuilding after life changes shape unexpectedly. Somewhere out there, somebody else is sitting in the dark right now trying to figure out whether they still deserve peace after being hurt. Maybe this story will help them too. And if you stay with this channel, there are more stories waiting for you in the playlist ahead. Stories about people who lost themselves trying to save relationships. Stories about quiet strength, hidden truths, second chances, and the strange ways life rebuilds us after heartbreak. Sometimes the next story arrives exactly when we need it most. And sometimes healing begins the moment we finally realize we were never as powerless as other people wanted us to believe.